He sat in silence, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the throne before him. A velvet cushion supported what was once a man, now a grey, bloated corpse dressed in full papal regalia. His skin sagged like wet parchment. His fingers, blackened and stiff, peeked from under the rings of his once holy office. On either side, cardinals shifted uncomfortably. The crowd held its breath. One clergyman vomited. The accused said nothing, couldn't say anything. He'd been dead for 7 months, but that didn't matter. This was a real trial, with real judges, real charges, real consequences. And the corpse, yes, the actual, decaying, God-forsaken corpse, was about to lose. Before we go deeper, pause, ask yourself, what kind of madness drives a man to drag a body from its grave just to put it on trial? What kind of system allows this? And more importantly, who could pull this off? Make no mistake, this isn't fiction. This isn't a lost Monty Python sketch. This actually happened in the heart of medieval Europe, in the holiest court on earth. If you're new here, subscribe right now, because stories like this one, they don't just make you laugh. They make you question everything about power, faith, and the insane things people do when they think God is on their side. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you were the judge in this courtroom? So how did we get here? The year was 897, and Europe was still clawing its way out of the dark. The Holy Roman Empire was less a shining bastion of Christian virtue and more a chaotic mess of kings, bishops, and power-hungry families stabbing each other in the name of the Lord, and at the center of it all, the papacy. The Pope wasn't just the head of the church, he was a king among kings. He made emperors, he crowned rulers. His word could bless your soul or condemn your family to damnation, which made the position a prize, a bloody, vicious, backstabbing prize. Enter Formosus, a man of ambition, intelligence, and enemies. So many enemies. Formosus wasn't born into power, he earned it. First as a diplomat, then as a bishop, and finally as pope in 891. But even before he sat on the holy throne, controversy followed him like a shadow. He was excommunicated once, then forgiven, accused of trying to seize power in Bulgaria, then sent to crown a Holy Roman emperor. He played sides, broke alliances, and walked political tightropes over pits filled with knives. He was cunning and dangerous, and in the end, dead. Natural causes, they said. But nothing about Formosus's life or his afterlife would ever be called natural, because not long after he was buried, another pope took his place, one who hated Formosus with a passion so deep it survived the grave. His name was Stephen VI, and to him death was not the end. It was only the beginning. And when Stephen looked at Formosus's grave, he didn't see peace. He saw unfinished business. Stephen VI didn't inherit the throne of St. Peter, he seized it. And the first thing he did, once the papal ring was on his finger, was plan revenge. To understand why Stephen would order the exhumation of a rotting corpse just to scream accusations at it, we need to understand who he was and who he wasn't. Stephen wasn't a political genius. He wasn't especially devout. He wasn't even particularly respected. But what he lacked in diplomacy, he made up for in rage, raw, festering rage. Against whom? Against one man, Formosus. You see, Formosus had made enemies the way most people collect coins. He'd angered rival bishops, exiled noble families, and crossed the powerful Spoleto dynasty, whose political influence stretched deep into the Italian peninsula. Stephen was one of their men, a puppet, some whispered. Others called him a time bomb. Either way, Stephen had watched Formosus rise, manipulate, and finally die in peace. That, to him, was intolerable, because the real crime Formosus committed wasn't heresy, it was winning. And Stephen, he needed to win something too. The church at the time was not some untouchable institution of purity. It was a nest of power deals, secret debts, political favors, and personal vendettas. Popes were rarely holy men. They were survivors of a brutal game, and Stephen had just been placed in a seat that burned hotter than hell itself. The people didn't love him, the clergy didn't trust him. Rome was full of whispers and knives. He needed a distraction, a scapegoat, a corpse, and so he summoned the cardinals. His demand was simple, outrageous, and impossible to refuse. Dig him up. But, Your Holiness, dig him up. The order was signed, official, irrevocable. Formosus would be exhumed and put on trial. The cadaver synod was born. The preparations were grotesque. The body had been buried for months. It stank. The flesh was collapsing. The jaw hung open like it had tried to scream underground. But that didn't matter. They dressed him anyway. Full papal vestments, robes, rings, the tiara of the pontiff. They sat him on a throne inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the official papal court. They tied his arms to the chair so he wouldn't slump. His head kept falling. They tried to prop it up. It didn't work, so they added more string. Candles were lit. Incense was burned to cover the stench. But everyone could still smell it. He was called the accused. A deacon was assigned to speak on his behalf. The poor man trembled through every word. He addressed a corpse as Your Holiness, while trying not to retch. The charges, they were laughably convoluted: usurping the papacy, violating canon law by transferring between bishoprics, breaking an oath made under Pope John VIII. Most of them were either administrative technicalities or already resolved years earlier. But that wasn't the point. The trial was never about justice. It was about humiliation, Stephen shouted. He waved. He pointed accusing fingers at a decaying face. He ranted for hours, mocking the dead man, calling him a heretic, a liar, a snake. At one point, witnesses say he stormed over to the corpse and screamed directly at it. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. The Pope was God's voice on earth. And at that moment, God was raving. The defense offered little. What could be said? Formosus said nothing, of course. But his silence echoed through the basilica like thunder. Then the verdict. Guilty, of course, but it didn't end there. Stephen wanted more. He declared all of Formosus's acts as Pope invalid. Every ordination he performed was null. Every bishop he appointed was illegitimate. Sacraments, marriages, confessions, all erased. Then came the final insult. They stripped the corpse one by one. They removed the papal garments, the rings, the sash, the gloves. Then, in a ritual both symbolic and savage, they cut off the fingers Formosus had used to bless the people. Each one fell to the marble floor with a sickening tap. And then they threw him in the Tiber River. That was supposed to be the end, but it wasn't, because the corpse came back. A few days later, fishermen found the body bloated, cracked, but somehow still intact. It had washed up downstream, caught in reeds near the edge of the city, locals whispered. It was a sign. Rome, a city steeped in prophecy and paranoia, didn't take kindly to desecrated saints. And to many, that's what Formosus had become. A martyred pope, stripped and defiled by a madman. The people began to murmur. The clergy grew uneasy. Stephen's enemies saw an opening. The corpse was recovered quietly. Some say monks took it. Others claim it was a mob of angry townspeople. Either way, it was reburied in secret. But the damage was done. Stephen had won the trial, but he'd lost everything else. And the dead weren't done with him yet. Stephen VI should have felt victorious. He dragged his enemy from the grave, put him on trial in front of the world, and declared him a fraud before God and man. The corpse was dumped. The verdict was written. The papal chair was his, uncontested, but something was wrong. The people didn't cheer, they whispered. At first, it was behind closed doors, then in the markets, then outside churches. Quiet rumors that felt too heavy to laugh off. The corpse had floated back. He had returned. God was watching. The city of Rome, already unstable and hungry for drama, began to stir like an open wound. The synod didn't cleanse the church, it infected it. Inside the basilicas, young clerics questioned everything. If Formosus's ordinations were invalid, then half the bishops in Italy had no authority. Were their sacraments still holy? Were their prayers heard? Did marriages still count? Could sins be forgiven by a bishop declared fake? People panicked. In the religious chaos of 9th century Europe, these weren't just academic questions. They were spiritual landmines. If you died unconfessed by a fake priest, your soul could be damned. If your child had been baptized by one of Formosus's bishops, was that child now unclean? Stephen didn't realize it at first. He thought the trial had solidified his rule, but all he'd done was detonate a theological bomb with a slow fuse, and then the dreams began. No one knows exactly when the stories started, but they spread like fire. Some claimed a pale man in tattered papal robes was seen walking near the riverbanks at night. Others swore they saw the severed fingers laid out like relics in the square, rearranged each morning by invisible hands. In the poorest districts, people lit candles in secret, praying to Formosus, the dead pope. to protect them from the living madman who now ruled. They called it heresy, but it felt like justice. And in the palace, Stephen began to unravel. He stopped sleeping. He held emergency meetings with bishops who didn't want to be seen with him. He grew paranoid, constantly accusing servants of treason, whispering about poison and secret plots. Once during Mass, he reportedly shouted at a statue of Christ, screaming that he was the true victim. But the backlash didn't stop at whispers and ghost stories. Soon it turned to revolt. The streets grew restless. Stephen's enemies, those same bishops and nobles Formosus had once fought against, now saw an opportunity. Their rival had made himself a national embarrassment, a grotesque symbol of religious excess and insanity. The people no longer feared Stephen, they pitied him, or worse, they laughed. That's when the mob came. They didn't come with pitchforks. This wasn't a peasant revolt. It was quieter, more precise. One night, as Stephen was preparing for bed, palace guards turned on him. His inner circle had already fled or switched sides. There was no trial, no ceremony, no bishops, no robes. They threw him in a dark stone cell alone. The man who had tied a corpse to a throne was now chained to a wall, screaming into the silence. And then justice, real or poetic, depending on how you see it. In August of 897, only a few months after the Cadaver Synod, Pope Stephen VI was found strangled in his prison cell. Some say it was suicide, others assassination. But the message was clear. You do not put a corpse on trial and walk away clean, but wait. It gets weirder. You'd think the madness ended with Stephen's death. You'd think the church would have looked at the Cadaver Synod and said, we've gone too far. But this was medieval Rome. And medieval Rome didn't just lean into chaos. It institutionalized it. Stephen's successor, Pope Romanus, immediately nullified the synod's ruling. Formosus was posthumously declared innocent. His acts were reinstated, his corpse reburied with honors. All was forgiven until the next pope, Pope Theodore II, came in hot, declaring Stephen's acts invalid and calling the Cadaver Synod a satanic farce. He ordered Formosus reburied again, this time with military guards to prevent further reconsiderations. But even that didn't stick, because soon after, Pope Sergius III rose to power, and he had also hated Formosus. Guess what he did? He reversed the reversals, declared Formosus guilty again, claimed the Cadaver Synod was valid, reinstated Stephen's legacy, dug up the theological mess all over again. It was like a divine slapstick routine, with each new pope undoing the last. In the span of a few years, the church officially condemned, forgave, re-condemned, and re-forgave a single dead man multiple times. At this point, you have to ask, who was really on trial, Formosus, Stephen, or the very idea of infallibility? Because while bodies were being buried and exhumed like political footballs, one thing became disturbingly clear. The church wasn't just fighting over dogma, it was fighting over truth itself. The Cadaver Synod stands today not just as a bizarre footnote in church history, but as a chilling reminder of how power makes monsters. Stephen wanted justice, or maybe revenge, or maybe just attention. He got all three, but he also got exactly what he gave: humiliation, chaos, and a grave that never slept, that people never forgot. And neither did the corpse. Formosus didn't speak, he didn't argue, he didn't move. But somehow he won. The stage was set. A dead man in robes, a throne surrounded by incense, a hall full of whispering clergy, uncertain nobles, and attendants trying not to vomit from the smell. And above it all, a man in papal white, eyes bloodshot, fists clenched, preparing to scream at a corpse. This was not a nightmare. This was the Cadaver Synod. Let's break this down as it really happened. Because it wasn't just absurd, it was orchestrated, carefully, methodically, grotesquely staged for maximum humiliation. First, the location. The Basilica of St. John Lateran, the most sacred seat of papal power in Rome. Think of it as the Vatican's elder brother, older, deeper in tradition, more soaked in spiritual gravity. If you were going to damn someone eternally, this was the place to do it. The corpse of Formosus had been dug up at Stephen VI's order. He'd been buried with papal dignity, robes, rings, the full honor that was stripped. His corpse pulled from the tomb, dressed again not for burial, but for court. Observers wrote that the body had already begun to collapse inwards. The jawbone was barely attached, skin peeled. The hands were swollen and black at the nails. His eyes were gone, sockets hollow and dark. And yet they placed him upright, on a throne at the front of the basilica. That throne had been his in life. Now it would be his courtroom. The charges Stephen presented were theatrical in their complexity, that Formosus had illegally seized the papacy, that he had served as bishop of two places at once, an ecclesiastical no-no, that he'd conspired against his predecessor, Pope John VIII, that he'd broken sacred oaths. None of this was new. These were the same tired accusations flung during Formosus's life, debated, dismissed, rehashed. But that wasn't the point. Stephen wasn't looking for legal truth. He wanted a ritual, a spectacle, an exorcism, not of demons, but of pride, of legacy, of memory. Formosus had humiliated his enemies by succeeding. Now his enemies would humiliate him by destroying his name, even in death. And so it began, a trial with a corpse. The defense? A terrified deacon assigned the role of advocatus cadaveris, defender of the dead. He stood beside the body, voice trembling. He addressed Formosus in the third person, referred to him as the accused. Occasionally he turned to the corpse, as if awaiting input. The courtroom became theater. The audience didn't laugh. No one dared. The few notes we have from eyewitnesses are grim, formal, terse. One wrote, "The air smelled of rot and incense and fear." Stephen paced, he screamed. At times he pointed directly into Formosus's eyeless face, as if daring him to answer. He read each charge aloud. He described Formosus's life not as a papal career, but as a trail of lies. Each promotion, each ceremony, a betrayal. At one point he tore a ring from the corpse's finger and held it up like evidence in a murder trial. This, he declared, was worn by a man who deceived the faithful. Gasps or silence, depends on the version. But there's one thing all the versions agree on. No one stopped him. When the verdict was read, it was already known. Formosus was declared guilty of everything. There would be no leniency, no posthumous forgiveness, no indulgences. Stephen ruled that all of Formosus's acts as pope were to be erased from history. Every bishop he ordained, null. Every priest, every deacon, every cleric he'd elevated, instantly illegitimate. Their holy acts, invalid, their blessings, meaningless. The church didn't just bury Formosus, it unmade him. And then came the execution. Yes, you read that correctly. A punishment for a corpse. Stephen ordered the body stripped of all papal garments, one by one, the cloak, the stole, the chasuble, the gloves, the mitre, until nothing remained but rotten flesh and shame. Then, in an act of desecration so severe it would echo for centuries, he had the fingers cut off, specifically the right hand. The fingers Formosus had used to offer blessings, to perform rites, to consecrate the holy. Each digit was severed with a blade wrapped in cloth and discarded. And finally his body was dragged from the basilica, hauled through the streets of Rome like garbage. Crowds watched in silence as soldiers dumped it into the Tiber River, the great artery of the city. Water splashed. The corpse sank. Stephen thought it was over, but the river gave him back. Days later, the body surfaced. Fishermen found it bloated, caught in reeds near the city edge. It hadn't decayed the way they expected. Rumors spread the body was untouched. A miracle, a message. The hand of God refusing to let a saint be profaned. A group of monks took the body and buried it in secret. But that wasn't the end. Something had shifted in Rome. The mood turned. People whispered not about Stephen's justice, but his madness. The church hadn't been purged. It had been poisoned. The cadaver synod was no longer a verdict. It was a stain, and it wouldn't wash off. Cardinals grew uneasy. Bishops grumbled. The Roman people, exhausted by famine, corruption, and humiliation, began to murmur, then chant, then act. Stephen had unleashed something, but it wasn't righteousness. It was revolt, and the corpse, silent as it was, had already spoken louder than any pope in living memory. The Tiber gave him back. That was the moment everything began to unravel. Rome was a city where miracles mattered, where signs were more trusted than reason, and divine justice often looked suspiciously like mob justice with incense. So when the body of Formosus surfaced, weeks after it had been thrown into the river intact and still wearing tattered remnants of papal garments. The message wasn't subtle. God, the people whispered, had spoken, and he was furious. Stephen VI had tried to erase a pope from history, but instead he gave him a second life, a myth, a martyrdom. Formosus became more powerful dead than he had ever been alive. At first, the backlash was quiet. A few clerics refused to sign decrees validating the synod. A handful of churches quietly continued to recognize Formosus's ordinations. Bishops avoided Stephen's invitations, and in monasteries across central Italy, rumors spread like plague. Visions of Formosus appearing in dreams, silently raising his mutilated hand, bleeding where fingers had been cut. Then came the curses, not metaphorical ones, literal ones. Scribes began recording strange deaths, sudden illness among Stephen's allies, unexplained accidents, fainting in churches. No one could prove anything, but everyone felt it. Something unnatural had been unleashed. They called it the Pope's curse. Stephen didn't help his case. He doubled down. He tried to ban sermons that mentioned Formosus. He ordered clerics to denounce him as a fraud from the pulpit. He ordered paintings depicting Formosus to be removed. One church that refused was mysteriously burned down 3 nights later. Coincidence? Rome didn't think so. Meanwhile, the political ground beneath Stephen's feet began to crack. The Roman nobility, already sick of papal chaos, grew restless. Factions began to shift. Old allies of Formosus re-emerged from exile, emboldened by the public rage. The people began gathering in the streets at night, lighting candles outside churches where Formosus had once prayed. No violence yet, but the air buzzed. Then in July 897 came the breaking point. A riot erupted outside the Lateran palace. What started as a scuffle between guards and pilgrims turned into a mass protest. People chanted Formosus's name. Stones were thrown. A guard was stabbed. Within hours, the palace was surrounded, and Stephen, he hid. He locked himself in a chamber with 3 guards and refused to come out. When the mob finally broke through the gates, Stephen was gone, captured, dragged from the room like a criminal, his papal garments ripped from him by force. He was beaten lightly, perhaps intentionally. They wanted him alive. He was thrown in a cell, not a dungeon, a sewer beneath the Lateran. There, knee-deep in cold filth, Stephen VI spent his final month as pope. No throne, no candles, no robe, just the echoes of water and the sound of rats in the walls. Some say he sang to himself. Others say he screamed the name Formosus over and over until his voice gave out. But what's certain is this. In August of 897, just weeks after orchestrating one of the most infamous rituals in church history, Pope Stephen VI was found strangled in his cell. Officially, no culprit was ever named. Some said it was suicide. Others claimed he was murdered by guards acting under orders. A few whispered it was Formosus himself, his spirit finally finishing what the river couldn't. Rome didn't investigate. Rome celebrated. And that tells you everything you need to know. But the curse didn't end with Stephen. In the years that followed, the papacy became a carousel of chaos. 9 popes in less than 20 years. Assassinations, poisonings, imprisonments. One pope's tongue was cut out. Another fled the city disguised as a monk. One was dragged from the altar mid-sermon. Formosus's trial had broken something, not just the spine of papal authority, but the illusion that the church was above the same madness it claimed to condemn. The Cadaver Synod was meant to be the final word. Instead, it became a starting pistol for one of the darkest decades in religious history. And yet, amidst all of this, something strange happened. Formosus began to reappear, not as a ghost, but as a symbol. Churches quietly restored his name. Bishops who had been declared illegitimate began performing rites again. People began referring to him not as a cursed pope, but a wronged one. By the time Pope John the Far took the throne, barely 2 years after Stephen's death, Formosus was officially rehabilitated. The synod was declared null and void. His body was reburied with honors. Again, a new stone was placed above the grave. No inscription, no fanfare, but the people knew the dead pope had won. But what about Stephen? What legacy did he leave? A cell, a strangled corpse, and a theological question that still makes scholars squirm. Can the dead be guilty? Can justice reach beyond the grave? And if it can, who speaks for the corpse? They thought it ended when the corpse hit the water, but the dead don't drown, not the ones judged before the eyes of God and men, not the ones whose silence echoes louder than their words ever could. Rome was quiet, not the soft, holy silence of prayer, but a hush born from something deeper, heavier, the kind of silence that weighs on the ribs like a coffin lid. Streets once filled with shouts and merchants now echoed with whispers and hurried footsteps. People crossed themselves twice without knowing why. No one looked directly at the Lateran anymore. The building had grown taller or darker, or maybe it just felt that way. Inside the Vatican walls, monks wrote slower, hesitated more, as if any word committed to parchment might become evidence in some future unholy trial. Because if they could put a corpse on trial, who was safe? It didn't take long. Rumors bloomed like mold in damp catacombs, that the river ran black the night they threw the body in, that fishermen pulled up fingers in their nets, brittle, grey, and curled in accusation, that a woman's child was born mute after hearing the verdict shouted from the courtroom steps, and worse, that God had turned his face away from Rome. Even the weather changed. Storms rolled in too often. Candles sputtered for no reason, and during Mass, some swore the Eucharist tasted of blood. The people, terrified, didn't blame God. They blamed the Pope. At first, Pope Stephen VI basked in his grotesque triumph. He'd made an example of Formosus, reduced his name to a curse, his legacy to rot. But power bought through spectacle comes with an expiration date. Less than a year after the synod, the same crowds that had watched in awe now seethed with unease. The Vatican guards became anxious. Priests whispered of demons walking the halls. The bishops began quietly refusing Stephen's orders. Then, in the dead of night, the palace was stormed. No trumpets, no resistance, no angels. The Pope was dragged from his bed in his nightclothes, face pale, eyes wide with the realization that he had become the very thing he feared. A symbol. He was imprisoned in a cell where the walls leaked and the rats never blinked. Weeks later, he was found strangled with a length of priestly vestment. Some say it was justice, others say it was prophecy fulfilled. The Cadaver Synod sent shockwaves through Christendom. Churches, as far as Francia and Saxony, sent panicked letters to Rome demanding answers. Councils were called. Records were burned. Historians later noted how many official documents from Stephen VI's reign simply vanished, but it was too late. The synod had set a precedent that the dead could be judged by the living and that politics could wear holy robes. No canon law would ever fully recover. The boundary between divine justice and mortal vendetta had cracked, and through that crack poured fear, doubt, and silence. Future popes would pretend it never happened. Some would go further, condemning it publicly, annulling its rulings, but no one could erase the image, a rotting corpse in full papal regalia, slumped in a courtroom while the church shouted at its own reflection. In cloisters and castles across Europe, the memory endured. One monk in Cluny wrote, "If the dead must answer for their sins before men, then who will answer for the living?" In the Byzantine court, diplomats laughed, but uneasily. Even the pagan tribes to the north heard of Rome's madness and sharpened their axes, wondering if Christian order was as fragile as the flesh it worshipped. And in whispered conversation, a new phrase was born, half joke, half curse: Cadaver Synodus. Time passed, names changed, thrones shifted, but the image remained. A trial without breath, a courtroom haunted by decay. Formosus, once obscure, became legend. Saints and sinners alike argued over his soul. Was he a martyr, a monster, a pawn? The truth mattered less than the myth, and the myth was powerful. Artists painted the scene in shadows and candlelight. Poets wrote verses where bones sang of betrayal, and the people, those who had no power, retold the story as a warning. Beware those who fear the dead, for they are ruled by ghosts. Centuries later, historians would struggle to explain what happened in that courtroom. Was it madness, politics, heresy? Or was it something simpler, a desperate man clinging to control, trying to kill the past by desecrating its corpse? The Cadaver Synod didn't just expose the cruelty of a single pope. It revealed a deeper rot, that when faith becomes fear and power wears the mask of God, even the dead cannot rest. The trial was over, the verdict rendered, but the echo never stopped. To dig up the dead is not an act of justice, it is an act of vengeance. And vengeance is rarely satisfied, even when the grave has been emptied. History remembers Stephen VI as a madman, a puppet, a tyrant in holy robes. But before he was a pope, he was a priest. And before that, he was a son, not to Formosus, not by blood, but in spirit, a disciple once, a loyal servant. That's what made it unbearable. Formosus had raised him, elevated him, and then betrayed him, or so Stephen believed. The deeper truth was uglier. It wasn't about heresy. It wasn't even about politics. It was about abandonment. Formosus had chosen others, backed wrong kings, opened Rome to foreign power, and when his enemies rose, Stephen was left behind, alone, humiliated, forgotten. So when the opportunity came to rise, Stephen took it, not to rule, but to punish. They dressed a corpse in papal vestments and put it on a throne. They hired a deacon to speak for a dead man. They shouted accusations into rotting ears. But the corpse never answered. It didn't need to, because the trial wasn't about Formosus. It was about everyone else, about Stephen screaming at the ghost of a father he couldn't please, about the church trying to deny its own corruption by mutilating a dead symbol, about the crowd, desperate to find someone, anyone, to blame for the rot they smelled but couldn't name. The Cadaver Synod was a mirror, and what Rome saw in it, it couldn't bear. Did Stephen win? Yes, for a moment. He humiliated his enemy, erased his name, broke his fingers one by one. But what he couldn't break was memory. Formosus returned, first in whispers, then in rebellion. Monks wrote of his suffering as martyrdom. People began praying at the spot where his body was dragged, and Stephen strangled in a cell, alone, forgotten by the very powers he served. Victory, if that's what it was, lasted less than a year. The price, eternity. What does it mean to put faith on trial? The Cadaver Synod forced the church to look at itself and flinch. For centuries, popes had wielded divine authority. Their word was God's word, their hands holy. But now those same hands were digging up graves. It shattered the illusion. Kings no longer feared the papal court in the same way. Bishops grew cautious. Lay people laughed nervously. If the vicar of Christ could scream at a corpse, what did that say about heaven? The damage wasn't immediate, but it was permanent. A seed of doubt had been planted, and would one day blossom into reformation, rebellion, and fire. In every trial, there is a judge, a defendant, and an audience. But in the Cadaver Synod, those roles collapsed. The judge was mad, the defendant was dead, the audience was terrified. So who rendered the final verdict? History, and its judgment was merciless. The Cadaver Synod became the defining madness of an era, an event so grotesque it couldn't be forgotten, only suppressed. A dark laugh echoing through marble halls, through centuries. And in that echo, a question remains. Who was really guilty? The church would go on. New popes would rise. Reforms would come, be reversed, come again. But the synod left a scar, a quiet understanding that beneath every mitre, every throne, every solemn ritual, there lurked fear. Fear of failure, fear of memory, fear that the past might return not as wisdom, but as a corpse dragged into court. We still fear it in politics, in religion, in our own stories. We bury what shames us, then tremble when the ground stirs. Because if the dead can be put on trial, so can we. A throne, a corpse, a finger blackened and broken pointing, not at a heretic, not at a pope, but at us.